make it clear.
Well, I did not make the comment.
Bill is not about taking away rights. It is about giving opportunity.
Good, ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to Citizen A, where we wrap the week's current affairs with a panel of bloggers and opinion shapers. Joining me tonight is the editor of the Daily Blog Live, commentator and journalist Selwyn Manning, and he is an author, a columnist and political commentator. Proof that the revolution will be televised. Blogger Chris Trotter, welcome to you both. Coming up tonight, issue 1, has the consensus building group been a giant waste of time? What now for meaningful traffic management in Auckland? Issue 2, the latest welfare reforms are being rolled out. When does beneficiary bashing stop being politically attractive? And issue 3 tonight, why is the defamation case against the NZDF by a journalist so important? Plus we'll end the show on a final word. But let's kick things off tonight with issue 1. So the $1 million ratepayers stumped up to pay for Len Brown's consensus building group to find ways to get Aucklanders to swallow the dead rat of having to self-fund our infrastructure needs looks like it may as well have been burnt now that all the suggestions for funding have been effectively turned down by the government. Selwyn, so Wellington does tell Auckland what to do after all. Has Len Brown been outplayed?
The play has been building up, and one would get to the position where you'd have to say yes. With the consensus group, one of the first points of consensus may be advised that they realise that now that the government has both feet in the arena of Auckland Council's affairs, that it cannot push such papers and such outcomes recommendations without it being double-checked by the national-led government.
Right. So where to now for Len? I mean, it seems he's walked into a checkmate.
Well, where to for Len Brown is that he obviously has an election campaign that he wishes to win. It seems at this stage in the campaign juxtapositioning, there is not a centre-right candidate that is shaping that could potentially rock him out of that position. So therefore it will be this coast, say steady as she goes, play on the rhetoric of having the necessary 2 terms to start to actually deliver on some of the visions that he's put out there. It's a steady as she goes campaign.
2023 is a very long way away for us to get our rail link, though, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And what the positives about that? Soon as the government came in and it said, okay, we will cough up the money that Len Brown and his Labour-leaning council has demanded of us, but it's going to be way out here on the timeline. What the good thing is that it's created an environment where solutions to the problems that very policy or that very delivery timeline mechanism creates, meaning the other candidates like John Minto has put out there a solution, and you've got others like the Green Party now, Julianne Genter, perhaps even pushing their solutions, the Green Party's solutions, ahead of time.
That's right.
From their
Chris, the CBG report admits in the final paragraph that even if it achieves all its budget goals of raising $12 billion from Aucklanders, the traffic flow from 2031 will be worse than it is now. How is this a solution and not a Band-Aid?
Well, it's not a solution, and I think the best name for it is a political gambit by the Mayor, Mr. Brown, and a clever political gambit. I mean, you gather people from business, you gather people from the unions even. No one's done that for a while. And you get them to come out with a report. Well, it gives you something to talk to. It is not a viable way of solving Auckland's problems. And no one has really addressed the problems of Auckland in a comprehensive fashion, in a believable fashion, and in one which, in a sense, was going to future-proof this city since the late 1940s. And the Labour government, the first Labour government then, looked ahead and saw that Auckland would grow. It took steps to shift the traffic around it in terms of planning. It took steps to link it by rail. And of course, this never happened. This was the Auckland that never was. But what what that first Labor government plan shows is that Auckland's problems cannot be solved by Auckland. Just as Balclutha's problems cannot be solved by Balclutha, or Napier's problems cannot be solved by Napier. We're one country. The development of a city, the providing of the very necessary infrastructure to all communities in New Zealand is the business of the state. Now, as Selwyn alluded to just a few moments ago, you've got a situation where the state is in an antagonistic position with the city of Auckland. Now, there is nothing good that can come of this. I think the reason, the state, i.e. the national-led government, is at odds with Len Brown and his council is simply because he comes from the wrong side of the political spectrum. They had anticipated a much more right-wing figure in that role. That's what the whole of Greater Auckland was set up to produce. It didn't produce the desired result, and this is the outcome. But until Wellington has a clear vision of what it wants Auckland to look like, of how many people it wants to live there. I mean, the idea that you just allow Auckland to go on growing and growing and growing at the rate of about the city of Palmerston North or Dunedin every 2 or 3 years is just absurd.
Yeah.
I mean, the government of the day, and it should be a bipartisan position here, has a responsibility to plan the country's future. Just to let Auckland grow like Topsy is not a solution.
There's a big thing to this. I think that there is a vacuum relating to policy about regional development in this country. Ever since we saw, the Labor-led governments of the early part of the 2000s ease off the regional development, which was led by Jim Anderton.
That's right.
We've seen Auckland become the centre, and some, I think, believe the economic saviour of the country. The coordinated aspects of the country and regional development. If there's a party out there that is trying to get a momentum to take back provincial seats, and one would hope that there is at the moment, and that would be the Labor Party, maybe it would wise up to that and start to push regional development as a big ticket.
Selwyn, some middle class angst on display this week with criticism that we can't afford John Minto's free public transport plans. If all the current plan can achieve is a traffic system more clogged than it is now, why not something more radical like free public transport?
Yeah, well, the free public transport, people, when they look at something like that, they think, free, come on. Who's going to pay for this? The money's got to come from somewhere, and it does. But the calculations do show that it comes in at around about just over half of what the Brownlee and the national-led government is proposing here. But the thing is, there's another thing here too. I think everybody that looks at this and starts to think about it, and I'm sure all the viewers tonight will see this in this way too, that you've got a situation where the government says, yep, we're going to put this amount of money to solve Auckland's problems. Yeah, it's in 2023, 2025 before you see anything starting to shape, but it's coming. Now, come on, these guys are all going to be gone by then.
Exactly.
You get to 2017,
Meaningless
and they'll be
promise.
saying, no, all the out clauses here will come into play. We're not going to commit to this. It's tight fiscal times.
Yeah.
Everybody knows
Yeah.
that that's
It's
the
a
game. It is a
smokescreen.
gambit.
Chris, when does Kian Joyce start insisting that Auckland sells its assets? Because that's where this is going, right?
Oh yes, that I am sure is somewhere in their thinking. And you can't really blame Tories for being
That's
Tories.
what they do. That's what they do.
It's the solutions they look for.
Sell it to our rich friends.
What is required here, though, is for somebody somewhere, either in the Auckland City Council or in one of the various political parties, to stand up and say, look, let's just stop this. Let's sit back and talk about the future of the country as a whole, whether we want Auckland to be this great elephant sitting on the end of our country, sort of weighting it down, or whether perhaps we might want to direct some of the immigration into other parts of the country, whether or not we want to do, for example, what the third Labor government wanted to do, build a whole new city. They were going to build the city of Rolleston, if anyone watching is old enough like me to remember that. But that was one alternative. And that is what countries across the sea have done. But quite honestly, the idea that you set up the country's largest city in some sort of antagonistic role to the government of the whole country. And the government puts this proposition forward. Oh yes, well, we'll help out Auckland in its infrastructure problems, but Auckland's got to find at least half, as if Auckland was something other than New Zealand.
Final question to both of you. When does Len, or what does Len need to promise right now to hold on to the mayoralty?
I don't think we'll see any promises of big
'Cause he
ticket
knows how
items.
limited it is, doesn't he?
I think he's going to be showing a conservative, centrist type of campaign policy rollout here. And I think it is one where Len knows, and his team around him know, that he has been a very big visionary in the last 3 years, and he initially campaigned on vision. We've seen some of that vision being well debated, like what we're doing tonight.
Yep.
But what they've got to do is to show that that vision is going to materialise into something real, and I think that they will position the next term, if he is successful, as
we
the
start seeing the
promise.
fruits, right.
That will be the promise.
What does Len need to do?
Well, he campaigned in poetry and now he's governing in prose, and he will try to build on this image he's created of a man with a vision but with the smarts to make it happen. His opponents have no alternative now but to go negative against him. I understand that that is quite likely. How effective that will be, I guess, will depend on the quality of his opponents. Yeah.
Thank you, panel. Moving on with our second issue tonight. The latest welfare reforms are being rolled out. Disqualification thresholds have been inflated with the purpose of cutting benefits off and saving money. Chris, the goal of jobs is held up when criticisms attack these policy changes. But what is actually wanted here? Work where people feel they are productive and valued, or low-wage menial work where beneficiaries have very little bargaining leverage? I mean, what are we actually setting up as our goal for jobs?
Well, it's impossible now, given the rhetoric, given the way this whole issue has been framed, to avoid the conclusion that these policies have a number of desired outcomes, but the most desired outcome on the part of the government is to create a large number of people who act as a kind of there but for the grace of God go I.
Right.
People in a situation so dire, so hedged around with harassment, with denigration, with stigmatization, that the rest of the community will do almost anything to avoid falling into that pit. And this is a very old way of dealing with an underclass, with a large number of poverty-stricken people. It was the thinking that built the British workhouses in the 19th century. These places were called the Bastilles, after the French, king's horrendous prison, which the revolution tore down. They were called Bastilles by the English working class. They were objects of horror and fear. People, in some cases, would rather die than go into the workhouse.
Right.
Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol is all about this.
Right. So they're the new social lepers?
These new regulations surrounding beneficiaries are the legal equivalent of those terrifying Victorian workhouses, and they have exactly the same purpose. Once you're in, the only thing you want to do is get out, and if you're out, you never want to get in.
When does beneficiary bashing stop becoming politically attractive?
Oh, hopefully at the next poll.
Yeah?
Hopefully at the next polling day, I should have said. I agree totally with what Chris is saying there, that this is stereotypical outclass. It's creating an outgroup so that the supposed majority can point a finger at a whole group in our society. What we're seeing is the accentuation, if you like, of all of the beginnings of a pretty bad class struggle here in New Zealand. Some would say that are already experiencing it. It's not the beginnings, mate. This is well entrenched, and I would tip my hat to that. When does it stop becoming politically an advantage for the national-led government to use this type of tactic? Well, only they can really answer that. I think that while the polls are showing that there is support for national over compared to the other parties, that it isn't going to fall back and start to consider its moral obligations to all New Zealanders.
Right.
It is quite satisfied that the community and the New Zealand that it is advancing ahead are those that are wrapped around its own kind.
Right.
And this group is outside of that.
Chris, isn't there a hidden cost of forcing people with mental health issues back to work with the threat of cutting off their benefits? Won't this simply be a result of more suicides, more self-harms, and more poverty rather than more jobs?
Yeah, but Martin, when I set up my own little business many years ago and I got my first annual accounts, there was a page that had this lovely line in it, cost of business. Oh, cost of business, interesting term. What it means is to run this business, it costs you something. To get your profit, you have to spend some money or you have to have some outgoings. This policy is just the cost of business for capitalism in the 21st century.
Right.
And that's how it's regarded. All those things you described will happen. You know? It is not efficient. It is costly, but it's simply the cost of business. And you pay it because the alternative to paying it would put the dominance of those, that 1% that everyone talks about in our society, at risk, and they are not disposed to being put at risk. They were put at risk in the 40s, 50s, 60s, right up to the 1970s when they did something about it very effectively, and they're not going back, not without a huge amount of pressure behind it.
So the social trauma amongst beneficiary families, amongst beneficiaries right now, the extra suicides, the self-harm, the poverty, the sudden need to go into prostitution, that's collateral damage, but we're comfortable with that level of damage?
Collateral damage in the war to preserve capitalism as we know it.
Selwyn, the suggestion now is to tag all kindergarten children of beneficiaries so that if they miss any classes, parents can face benefit cuts.
Yeah.
How are any of these changes to the benefit of the children?
Oh, they're not. Once you talk about collateral damage, the children and as they move into their adulthood are the victims of a system here, and it's not an ad hoc system. It's a controlled and well orchestrated and well strategized machine.
Right.
Well, I think we need to really realise that we do have a country here that is taking Ruth Richardson's mother of all budgets type of way of doing things to an excess. It is excluding people on the basis of points. It is not looking at, okay, this person's in need, so therefore they meet this inclusion kind of criteria. They're excluding. Why? Because they want to place pressure on that group in our society, and they also want to place the money that would normally go across there into another area, and thirdly, they want the unemployment figures to look good so they can crow about that all over the place. Just got to say on that point, the ANZ this morning said that it believes unemployment, despite all of this exclusion is going in, is going to be lifting up above 7% again.
Wow. So that would suggest that our real unemployment number could actually be a hell of a lot higher because
that's unemployment.
Right,
what we're talking here is the immoral abhorrence of excluding people who are sick.
Yeah.
The fantastic piece by your writer on the Daily Blog, Coley Tangerine, under that pseudonym, writing on all of this of people wanting to catch up.
Isn't it?
Yeah,
Eye-opening to
it's
actually
very
read
good work.
the experiences of people. Final question, a hard question to both of you on this. Would Labour, if they win the 2014 election, would they honestly roll any of this back? Because they didn't after Ruth Richardson, did they?
No, and in fact, if you look back at the policy formation, even after the election of the Labour Alliance government in 1999, you find this transition under Steve Mahari, the transformation of WINS into the Ministry of Social Development.
Yep.
Work was seen as the solution.
Yep.
That is why the benefit cuts were never restored.
That's right. Yeah.
They are a goad.
Yeah, working for families did not go down into the lower
No,
areas.
because it
and
is to
Helen
act
Clark
as
said
an
progressive
incentive.
Yes.
Now, this is still part, I think, of most of the Labour caucus's thinking.
Yep.
The Labour Party itself, I think, has a very strong desire to move beyond that. I think if you look at the platform that emerges from the November conference, it will be very interesting whether that determination to extend working for families down to the families of beneficiaries.
Would
It
they
will be
change
very
it?
interesting to
Well,
see.
I would hope so,
Yes.
because there is a political environment that suggests they must.
Right.
If they're going to assume office in 2014 to take the Treasury benches on a basis of the strength of the morality of their arguments and policies,
Then they have to.
then they have to.
Thank you, panel. Moving on with issue 3 tonight. Why is the defamation case against the New Zealand Defence Force by journalist John Stevenson so important? Selwyn, the NZDF has done all it can to twist and manipulate the true nature of New Zealand troops in Afghanistan. Is this case important? Because the NZDF's comments denigrating Stevenson were part of their disinformation campaign.
Yeah, well, it was, and it was also assisted by the executive government as well. Remember John Key at his press conference when Eyes Wide Shut, the Metro magazine cover story that
That's
John
right.
Stevenson wrote, was out on the newsstands, and the Prime Minister moved to discredit John Stevenson's reputation. The case that John Stevenson has taken to the Defence Force, by accusing it of defaming his reputation. If you're standing back, and I make these comments as a reasonably minded New Zealander, and in my opinion, when a journalist has spent years and years and years doing the research in a particular area, developing the expertise, doing what journalists are supposed to do to participate in progressing our country through critique, bringing to the fore information that would otherwise be kept in secret.
Yep.
That there is there's an ethical response that you would expect to come from those elected representatives, and that response would be, in the first instance, they could say, we don't believe that that's the case, but we will have a ministerial inquiry on something like this that will examine it. That would be the proper course that a government of the day would do. This lot sought, in my view, to make it appear that that person who had done all of that hard work was a joke, was not credible.
Chris, does John deserve compensation?
I believe so. The good New Zealand jury that by the time people are watching this may well have delivered a verdict will in a sense be saying something about New Zealand in 2013. If they find against John, I will be bitterly disappointed, because here is someone who has risked everything, his fortune, his reputation, his peace of mind, to say this is the truth. No matter what the state may say, I spoke the truth, and I want you, my fellow citizens, to say to the state, he spoke the truth. If his fellow citizens do not give him that support, that will be a terrible outcome.
Final question to both of you. When will we know the true nature of what our soldiers did in Afghanistan?
Well, we've had, once again, in my view, in reading the articles and seeing where the research was founded and the people that John Stevenson wrote, we've had a glimmer. We've had a little bit of an eye-opener on what went on. It must be remembered that what that article said had occurred was that New Zealand troops had knowingly passed over people in Afghanistan that they had in custody to the United States-led forces, knowing that they would be tortured. It's a crime.
Convention?
It's
Very
a crime.
clear.
The North European countries were also found out to have been doing the same, and I've got to say that they have approached this in a much more sophisticated and progressive manner than what New Zealand does. John's information suggests that's what occurred. Really, the state should do an independent inquiry on it.
When are we going to know what our soldiers were actually doing in our name in another country?
Well, once again, I think the jury will decide that. If the jury supports John, then I think it will be a huge incentive to people like John to go out and find the truth. If they fight against him, then that will send a very chilling message to all journalists.
Let's wrap the show with the final word. Selwyn, your final word this week is?
It's a little bit on the back of what you were talking about with the beneficiary exclusion type things. I think what we are seeing in New Zealand is the advancement of class divisions. That class is starting to become a big problem that governments need to address, but most significantly, those parties that are currently in opposition to develop policies around class. There's a big debate inside the Labour Party at the moment about how you meet a gender split of 50-50. And you've got to applaud all of the courageous kind of ways of achieving that goal. And I think most normally minded people agree with that. In my view, class should be right up there in the heels of that. That what we're seeing now are people that have got no representation in this parliament. That people on the basis of their class and distinction in that area are being excluded from not only being able to make ends meet with a dollar for dollar, but excluded from being able to find recourse through the parliamentary or democratic system as well. And that needs to change.
Chris, your final word this week?
I just want to comment on the words of Dr. David Bratt, who said that a doctor who was filling in the necessary documentation to allow a citizen to access a welfare benefit was doing something akin to putting them on, and I quote here, an addictive, debilitating drug, unquote. Now, this is the final confirmation of the right's rhetorical attack, which has likened welfare to drug addiction, hence the term dependency, a term taken from the treatment of drug addicts. And here we have the senior medical advisor to the Ministry of Social Development confirming this. I cannot understand how that statement could possibly have any scientific validity whatsoever.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Selwyn. Ladies and gentlemen, to my final word, a defensive and rightfully guilty Bill English lashed out this week at visiting economist Professor Robert Wade's assessment of the higher inequality New Zealand now lives under. The facts of our growing inequality under policies endorsed by the Finance Minister are glaring. The gap between high and low incomes has widened faster in recent decades in New Zealand, more than most developed nations. Across all adults, the top 1% owns 3 times as much wealth as the poorest 50%. New Zealand now has the widest income gap since detailed records began in the early 1980s. The average household in the top 10% of New Zealand has 9 times the income of one in the bottom 10%. Between 170,000 to 270,000 children live in poverty, depending on the measures used. 800,000 New Zealanders now live beneath the poverty line. Against that number, 29,000 people own 16% of New Zealand's wealth, and 13,000 New Zealanders have incomes over $250,000. And wages and benefits are too low for people to live on. It isn't an issue of budgeting, it is an issue of income. Bill English came across this week with his criticism of Professor Wade as the very glib voice of the privileged 1% that Wade warns against. Jack is as good as his master. Equality in these once egalitarian isles is shaky. Inequality is one of the issues of the 2014 election, and the sooner the political opposition appreciate this, the better. If you like tonight's show, please join our Citizen A Facebook site and connect with other like-minded news citizens, and follow me on my Citizen Bomber Twitter and Facebook page. Thanks for watching, whānau. Good night, Aotearoa.
Supporting local content so you can see more of New Zealand on air.